Hello and welcome to the Huddle Breakdown with me, Laura Bradburn. I am joined by Alan and the travelling James. James, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm I can disclose the location. I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Yeah, we're depositing our children this weekend at university. So we're going to be empty nesters well, I guess we're technically empty nesters, but we'll return home this week. So I got to enjoy the Friday game at the Pittsburgh CSC, which is my adopted home, now that the poor people of Pittsburgh have to deal with me several times a semester. So yes, always enjoy visiting with my friends at the Pittsburgh CSC. So shout out to them.
Yeah, I would love to visit there. It looks like a great CSC. I don't know what will ever take me to Pittsburgh, but if it does, I will definitely visit. Alan, how are you doing?
Yeah, a lot better, thank you. Again, apologies for missing last Thursday at the last minute, but it was unavoidable. I'll say no more. But yeah, good to be back. Thank you.
We'll just leave it as you failed a late fitness test and leave it at that, I think.
Yeah, failed quite a lot of things, yeah.
So let's get started looking at the football. Obviously, for anybody watching, you will be aware that we beat Falkirk 4-1 in the League Cup on Friday. So we've had a little bit of time to digest that and look forward to the Champions League game on Wednesday, which we'll be talking about before the end of the show as well. But James, Alan's got some very prepared notes and things on a few specific aspects of the game, but I'll come to you first and just ask your general thoughts on the game from your vantage point in Pittsburgh. How did it unfold the way you expected, or were you happy with the way it unfolded?
I was happy. I was relatively happy, relatively content. I thought that I thought the intensity with which we played and kind of our counter pressing, which generally speaking, when we have it amped up, is overwhelming for most opponents. So I think that was a big difference maker in the game. And Falkirk certainly have not seen that in their two league matches up until with their opponents, the opposition that they faced so far with Dundee United and Livingston. So, yeah, I thought, chance creation was pretty good. And given the selection, the rotation that was going on, which, again, I think is normal. It was good to see Sinisalo. We talked about that last week, kind of hoping to see that. So hopefully he's the cup keeper, at least for the League Cup. And I know ideally I'd like to see it for the Scottish Cup as well. But, yeah, so overall, high level, the idea that we're never going to concede chances is, so they did a pretty good job. They had some good opportunities from distance and forced some saves, which again, it isn't like mind-numbingly problematic or anything. But yeah, I think overall very content with how things unfolded, given the risk, which is, my concern was that they would maybe adopt a little bit more pragmatic on the margins, and if we had a rough day creating chances, it could get a little tighter. Fortunately, that wasn't the case.
Yeah, I mean, I was at the game on Friday and found it kind of strange because I had been at the Falkirk game last season and was expecting a little bit more of a challenge, I should say, from Falkirk, but I felt a bit like they struggled to keep possession, partly down to our pressing and perhaps down to their own passing. But yeah, they were certainly slightly less of a challenge and less of a formidable opponent for us than they had proved last season, because obviously they managed to get those 2 goals. And if I remember right, I can't remember if they were ahead or not in that game at any point, but certainly their first half performance was very strong in that previous game compared to this one. And speaking of which, Alan, you've got a few thoughts on comparing the two performances and how you felt they sort of stacked up against each other. What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I just thought it would be interesting to compare the two, because I think Falkirk got a lot of plaudits last year for putting in a really good performance. And I think it was a later round, as you say, they were 2-1 up quite deep into the second half, and Celtic had to kind of empty the A-list off the bench. It felt like to kind of turn around the tie. Nicholas Good in particular they couldn't live with. They were tiring. He came on fresh. And he was in his peak form at that point, and that was just too much for them. And I think most people think they're a positive addition to the top flight. They play pleasing to the eye football in general, but it's not naive, as I think James said on the Thursday pod. They're happy to go long because they've got pace up front on a relative basis. Certainly at Championship level, and probably at the lower end of the SPFL level, they've got pace up front. So they go early sometimes. They don't have to be dogmatic about always playing the short game. So they're an interesting team. They're a well organised team. As I've said before, other than probably one or two players, they're kind of fungible as well. Most players they can swap out, put in different options, and it doesn't really weaken the team. Everyone knows their job, and they do that job in that shape. So I thought it'd be interesting to compare, because they haven't really made a lot of changes to the squad since that team that came last year and won the championship. They've really only added Scott Bain and Brian Graham, and then the one concession that they made to James's point was they effectively dropped a nominal number 10 and put in another true central midfielder in Cartwright, who's on loan from Leicester City. He's more of a sitting player. So they had kind of three sitters in midfield, but none of them they're not like dogs of war type midfielders. The other two, Spencer and Tate, are very neat and tidy footballers, really. And I think this was their problem. I mean, chatting to my old pals from Falkirk after the game, really agreed with the view that they just look too nice. They look too nice for the Premier League. When you think about the teams that are going to be looks like they're going to be round about them at the bottom of the table, Livingston are as horrible as their charming manager. And, Livingston know how to grind out results. Livingston will do whatever it takes and change their style and be pragmatic, and they'll eke out results like they do with the resources that they've got, which is credit to Martindale. All joking aside, Dundee under Presley are going to be horribly defensive, and they're going to grind out the occasional point. And I think, I had Kilmarnock down there, but they've not actually lost yet, I don't think, this season. But I just felt with losing kids and losing some players, I felt they might be ones to struggle. But I think even in that company, Falkirk looked a little bit lightweight, a little bit, and some of the players who really stood out. I mean, in the League One campaign and in the Championship campaign, Brad Spencer, who sits in the middle of the pitch, he was virtually any games I watched them, he was man of the match. It was just like given. No, you might as well give him it before the game. He looks over physicalized in this company. He's not crashing into tackles. He's not getting much time on the ball. He's not able to dictate the game as he has been in the lower divisions. And the same for his partner in midfield, Tate, who's again another passer. He's not giving them that box-to-box physicality and athleticism. They've got Calvin Miller, who's got good pace, and he broke a few times to some good effect. And then in defence, they're quite weak, unfortunately. Other than the right back, Keelan Adams, who actually posted some really good numbers in this game, despite the fact that Falkirk were clearly struggling with Celtic's press and counter press. So I worry about them. I really do. I don't think they've got enough. I don't think they've got enough physicality, athleticism. They're almost too nice. They need to get a bit of devil into the side, really, to kind of combat some of the sides that are going to play at the bottom of the league. But actually, even if you compare, so as I look at the screen on my left of the high level team stats from the game on Friday, and on the right from last season, they're fairly comparable. I'll call out the kind of main differences, which are that Falkirk were able to execute even more passes per Falkirk defensive action, 10.4 on average on Friday versus 8.65. That speaks to Falkirk's lack of athleticism in the press. Didn't really trouble Celtic. Anytime by my metric you're getting more than 10 passes per defensive action, you're pretty comfortable on the ball. The XGs are kind of the same, actually a bit lower this season. Falkirk's was half. So they really didn't, as you said, Laura. The big difference was in the game was that Celtic got a lead, held on to the lead. They then got 2 quick goals, and that was it. Game over. They didn't need to go chasing in the last 20 minutes of the game to sort of boost XG, whereas they were 2-1 down last year, hence the high XG number, because for the last 20, 25 minutes of the game, Celtic were going hell for leather, shot after shot, chance after chance. They didn't need to do that against a tiring team this time because they had a 3-goal lead. So the XG numbers are a little bit deflated. But the more notable one here is that Falkirk just weren't able to create as many chances, quality chances, as they had last year. And the packing scores are quite revealing. That Celtic's packing score is significantly higher, and Falkirk's is significantly lower. So last year they were able to play through Celtic very effectively. This time they couldn't. They couldn't break because Celtic's counter press and press were far more effective than obviously they had been last year. And also the way that Falkirk were set up, Celtic were able to bypass the first line. They had essentially a 4-4-2 out of possession. Those two up front weren't causing any issue as far as pressing was concerned, and they were also quite narrow, meaning that the wide areas were always open for Celtic, and hence the centre backs posted incredibly high packing numbers, as we'll see, because it was so easy for Celtic to progress the ball up the field. Even Austin Trusty, that we call out for not being the most progressive passer, was pinging balls into Maeda's feet, quite easily without under no challenge, and Celtic were then able to get up the pitch quite easily. So I think they look like they've not improved in that sense. They've kind of gone backwards, and I think Celtic can be pleased, as James said, six changes, but actually what could have been a tricky game, they actually turned into something a lot more comfortable.
Just to ask before I go back to James for his thoughts, Alan, for those of us out there who, I know what it is, but for anybody that doesn't know what it is, passes per defensive action, how would you define that as a statistic?
Yeah, so it's in its purest form, and what the big data vendors will do is purely look at actions inside the opposition half, and it will be how many defensive actions. So you basically sum up the defensive actions that the opposition perform against you, so challenges, clearances, headers, interceptions, all that sort of thing, and then look at the number of passes that you had in the opposition half, and work out an average of how many passes did you complete per defensive action. It's as simple as that, and it's a kind of proxy for your ability to progress the ball under pressure, and also from the opposition's perspective, how aggressively are they perhaps pressing, and therefore reducing your passing game. I don't have the time, I suppose it comes down to tag everything with where it happens on the pitch. So mine is a little bit less pure. It's all actions and it's all passes. But pressing can be full court, right? So it's not a million miles away. And again, the key thing here is, as long as it's been calculated on a consistent basis, you can compare apples with apples, team versus team, and team versus the same opponent over multiple seasons. We're comparing on the same basis. So that's the key thing to take away really on that one.
Okay, good to know. I'll try and remember that one for next time. James, what do you make of Alan's assessments there of comparing this performance with the performance last season? Does that track with what you saw, and what do you make of the overall thoughts? Because I tweeted myself during the game that I just have a feeling sometimes when you watch teams, even if you only watch them against Celtic, you can kind of, in terms of comparing them to the other teams that you've seen play against Celtic, you can kind of guess where they're likely to end up. And I have to agree, I thought they were a little bit too nice. I do think they might struggle in the league, especially if they stick to trying to play this progressive football when there are other teams out there who could give them a game just as easily. Does that sort of fit in with your image of Falkirk after watching the game?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a interesting test case on more technical, skill-based, progressive game plan. It looks like they're going to try to execute with what is increasingly looking like a hellscape of physicality across the league. I mean, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, by the way. I think what, Kettlewell has been a fairly direct, manager, almost in the style of Robinson at St. Mirren. Like, I think they're cut from a similar cloth, let's say. And I was following the cup game between Kilmarnock and Hearts on the weekend, and I hadn't realized, like, I hadn't been following Kilmarnock's window that closely, but they signed a 6'7" striker.
Yeah, I saw him.
Yeah, when you get to that, that's like Vassal levels of different shape. Vassal looking like a true rugby player. So and our friend Ross at Dundee United has assembled a huge lineup of individuals, of human beings playing at Dundee United. So there's just going to be a lot of very physical, big, strong teams that are playing in, I would say, somewhat adjacent styles of play that will test a Falkirk type of team. So I agree with Alan. I'm hopeful that they'll be able to withstand that and maybe keep themselves comfortably in the safety zone. But it's going to be difficult. I agree. And it'll just be interesting to see how that breaks. As to Alan's first slide here of the data, I always like to fall back on one of Alan's dictums that I learned a while back, was the level of consistency or let's call it the correlation of packing scores to games and success, even more so than XG and XG differential. And I found it almost like in an emotional way, it fits with how you kind of interact with the game too. Meaning that, XG can be created by all kinds of randomness too. Balls drop or deflections that drop.
Or as in the case of that first Falkirk game, I have a memory of just everything we were hitting going in that day.
Well, that's the post shot XG, and you'll see that in the tables that Alan, the degree with which the post shot XG that game last season was materially higher. So that conforms with your memory. I think what the packing score does is it's almost like between the 18s. That's where the flow of the game, the ability for teams to counter against us, those opportunities, like Alan documented recently on our site in two great pieces on huddlebreakdown.com about transition risks that we're facing, and how when you're facing an opponent like Aberdeen and they just flush those opportunities and transition down the toilet, those things don't manifest in XG, but they tend to get reflected to a degree in this packing score, where they're able to take out and get the ball up the pitch and create 3v3s or that kind of situation and transition opportunities. So I think what you see in the comparison here is that if you almost did it like a packing score differential, that lined up with these two games. That we came on and really dominated the last 20 minutes of that game last year, but overall the flow of the game was pretty even for most of it. That was what made that game so kind of revelatory for Falkirk, was like, wow, these guys have just been promoted up into the championship and they're playing this new progressive way. And then they kind of went toe to toe with us and were able to look functional in that regard. And I think this weekend was not that. This was a very different kind of game. And I think that is manifested and reflected in that, I'll call it a little bit more nuanced, comprehensive metric that I look in Alan's data packs. That's like the first thing I go to, as I go down to his relative packing score. He has a chart that he puts in each of the data packs that show over the 90 minutes or plus what the packing scores are for each team. So I found that they tend to follow like the human interaction engagement of a game when you're watching it and how it feels. That tends to correlate really highly.
Yeah, we're always looking for stats that kind of fit in with how the game makes you feel, and that can make the translation between the two a little bit easier to follow. So it's good to have one like that kind of has that about it. But we do love a packing score at Huddle Breakdown, I have to say. They're very often getting quoted. Let's look at some of the more individual performances. Alan, one of the talking points heading into this game was who was going to play up front. Lots of people calling for Shin, lots of people calling for Ida to try and get his confidence up with a goal or two. Certainly when I arrived at the game on Friday, I wasn't expecting Johnny Kenny to be in from the start, which he was. And you've had a look at him individually to see sort of where he ranked in the game in terms of some of the top performance metrics. How did that pan out for old Johnny?
Yeah, so absolutely. A lot of interest because of the changes and who they were. Just before I get into that, Laura, you asked me a question before we came on air, and it was about, the degree to which Falkirk were really not coping with Celtic's pressing and counter-pressing, and was that noticeable in the data? I just wanted to touch on that, because although we're obviously going to spend quite a chunk of the show talking about the Almaty game, this tees up a little bit that transition from domestic to European football. So Falkirk had 14 defensive third losses. This is where they cough up the ball in their own defensive third. That was exactly the same as last year. The high end of, since I've captured that data, is probably more around like 25, I think, is the most. So it wasn't even one of the worst, in all honesty. But the pack turnover score, so this is a negative score because you cough up the ball and it has an impact in terms of you lose the ball and your own players are ahead of the ball, meaning they're not between the ball and the goal. So you kind of get a negative score for that. It was the team score for that was minus 105. So no, that wasn't necessarily the worst that we've ever seen, and it's kind of in line with a lot of domestic games where Celtic are very successful. So where domestic teams have a packing turnover score of minus 100 or more, right? There's been 37 occasions that's happened, and when I've recorded the data, this is domestic football. Celtic have won 31 of those and drawn 6, not lost any of them, right? And they've scored 106 goals and conceded 32. So when Celtic can force turnovers through their pressing domestically, it's carnage, and good things you generally flow from that. However, when we do that in Europe, there's been 7 games where Celtic have managed to force the opposition into over 100, minus 100 in pack turnovers, and we've only won 1. And that was against Slovan Bratislava, who were terrible. And we absolutely harried them to death. The other 6 games, we drew 1 and lost 5, because teams like Leipzig, Feyenoord, Lazio, Aston Villa, Bayern Munich, they'll accept that as the price of doing business. They'll accept that they're going to lose the ball in bad areas, confident that there's upsides if they break Celtic's press. So that dichotomy, I found that quite a stunning indicator of the gap between how Celtic play in terms of domestic football versus Europe, and what the impacts can be for playing this very front-footed pressing, counter-pressing game. Domestic teams, by and large, simply can't cope with it. Whereas in Europe, teams actually just see it as the price of doing business and actually bring it on and will kill you. We'll still have enough chances on the counter to absolutely kill you. So so Falkirk's performance in that regard wasn't actually particularly bad. It was kind of in line with a lot of domestic games where we win comfortably, was the answer to your question. But in looking at that, I think it revealed something quite interesting about playing in Europe, and that's very particularly relevant to the Almaty game, which we'll get onto, because they will be a team that will look to counterattack. Back to just cover off some of the interesting individual performances then from the Falkirk game. Johnny Kenny, I think there was a bit of reaction after the game. Obviously, he didn't score, but just by the way on these, right? So the thing that people can hold me to. What I hate online is when people post something like this on Twitter. They'll just put you all these data points and the numbers, and then they'll just leave it there. It's like, there you go. I'm a data analyst. I've done my job. It's like, fucking means nothing, right? It tells you nothing, right? This is just a prop. These numbers are just a prop. So I'll try and.
I remember Celtic doing that in direct response to me about a certain player. We'll not go into it. And people say I have a chip on my shoulder, but I'm telling you, they did it in direct response to me. And I said, Alan, that's a load of rubbish, isn't it? And I'll not say what you said, because you're more than welcome to say. But I do remember you saying that stats without context don't mean much.
Yeah. So, what is the story behind these numbers in terms of the actual performance, and what did our eyes also tell us? Right. So, listen, this was clearly a dominant game for Celtic. Created a lot of chances, reasonably high XG, won the game 4-1. The centre forward didn't score, no, correct, but was involved in the game to a reasonable degree. I mean, only completed 5 passes. That's not particularly an outlier for Celtic strikers under these systems that Ange and Brendan Rodgers have implemented. He did have 1 shot on target. 4 total shots was the highest anyone had. Total XG was 0.4. That's reasonable. It was the second highest. 5 possessions in the box was equal second. Bear in mind he only played 63 minutes. And actually, one thing that I'll call out that was really quite impactful on the game, we talked about the pack recoveries and turnovers and the pressing. He actually led the team in generating what's called a pack recovery score, which is the other end of the pack turnover transaction. Somebody loses the ball, somebody either forces that loss or they pick up the loose ball. Either of the two will get you the recovery positive score. He led the team in that. I think it was 3 or maybe 4 times where he either got a toe in or was the beneficiary of a loose pass. Maybe his positioning was good. He intercepted it. So that part of his game I thought was really good and actually a real positive. The extent to which he disrupted Falkirk's defence in their third and stole back possession on a few occasions. And his attacking numbers were decent, I think, if you look at it overall. But if I were to take away the sort of data and just sort of think about more from a scouting qualitative assessment, if I had to summarize it and boil it down, is he just seemed half a yard away to everything. He just wasn't quite there. The number of balls that flashed across the box, and he just wasn't there by half a yard. And I know it happened a couple of times. And I thought, well, it might just be bad luck. But then it happened a couple more times. I'm just thinking, see, that's the difference between a Johnny Kenny and a Kyogo. That speed of, it's not just thought, but speed of movement and thought, the two together, translating thought into fast movement and getting in front of the defender for that split second, that half yard in the box is what makes the top strikers. And he may develop that, but it certainly was kind of not evident. And it's almost cruel sometimes when you're playing a team that's obviously as overmatched as Falkirk were, that sometimes your striker can be made to look worse because they're just not scoring and they don't look like they're going to score. The chance that he had, that break where he was one-on-one with the defender, and that spoke to me a bit of a lack of belief and confidence that he just took the cheap shot from outside the box. It was never going to score from there. He'd lost all momentum. I mean, in that situation, accept that you've butchered the immediate shooting chance, shield the ball, bring a runner in. That's fine. Or do something outrageous. Try and not make the defender try a bit of skill. Try and get back into a better scoring position. Taking that shot in the way that he did is almost like we talk about bravery on the ball. That's an example of not being brave on the ball for a striker. So the numbers were okay. You could argue that was because of the context of the game. Little gold star for his off-ball work in terms of pressing and pressurising Falkirk, but just that lack of quality of movement and just consistently being a little bit behind the play when it really mattered.
Yeah, James, the discussions about who plays up front are going back and forth. People have made up their minds on Adam Ida. Some people think he could still do a job. The same goes for Kenny, and a lot of us don't have an opinion on Shin yet because we certainly haven't seen enough. I got a little bit of stick online, unusual, I know, for suggesting that it took Maeda to be in the...
You do try your best, Laura.
I do try my best. I got a little bit of stick for suggesting it took Maeda to be in the middle for us to break the deadlock, as he did. What's your opinion on Kenny at the moment? Where does he stand in terms of, how many future chances he's going to get, what he is currently doing with those chances?
Well, I think he'll be a good third striker behind Jamie Vardy, is what we're hearing this week. But no, I joke. We'll see. No, I think that he could reasonably be a third striker. I think I don't think there's any problem with that. Outside of the whole idea that we were going to have a youth striker, and I think he's probably too old for that. I mean, he's not old, but relatively speaking, in the modern game, I think he's 22. I mean, that's not young. Let's put it that way. So I think the more interesting conversation about what Alan just mentioned is the value of the striker position. And when you have teams like Celtic that off the ball in the attacking third with counter pressing, particularly against, Alan just mentioned that, quoting the statistics relative to the pack recovery, the pack turnovers that other teams have, and then how we basically just overwhelm domestic opposition. Well, somebody has to do that, and that's where Maeda excels. That's where, to a degree, I think, particularly in his first season and the second season, Kyogo excelled. I think less so in his seasons under Rodgers. Is that when we disorganized opposition, when quickly after they get possession for whatever reason, we turn the ball over or whatever, there's a rebound or whatever clearance, is that those are the moments of transition where they're disorganized. And I think, somebody like Kenny says that there's a question here. I don't know. I think so far, from what I've seen, he looks, and the sample size is limited, but he seems to be not only willing, but at least pretty functional, capable in that regard off the ball. Ida, I think the effort is there usually, and I'm just not sure he's as effective in his decision-making and spatial awareness of where he should be and doing what he can do to create that kind of chaos off the ball. And Yamada, we don't really know yet. That wasn't his reputation, from what I've heard and read, in Japan. Certainly has the physical capability to do it, given his quickness and his speed. So that could be a development opportunity for him at Celtic. So I think, long story short, is we don't have the solution yet. That, if Kenny could ramp up some of those issues on the development side that Alan pointed out, because of his off-ball functionality, that could be a real positive. And maybe that could get him up to maybe being a second choice striker at Celtic. I'm skeptical about that, to be honest, given his age and, making that leap. But I think these are the kind of issues that our good friend Derek McInnes is going to get an education on in continuing to play Lawrence Shanklin in a Tony Bloom team, because it's ridiculous when you're playing a team that has this type of pressing and counter pressing. I mean, that is a major engine for chance creation in many teams, including our own, particularly against domestic opposition. And if you're not doing the work, that's when you end up playing against organized, bunkered defenses. And it's just hard to create good chances against that, particularly when you've got good athletes, big athletes like we were just talking about. So that ability to have the disorganization in those periods of chaos, I think there is a lot of value to that. I'm not sure we know where all of the risk reward positives and negatives fall, because I think we have significantly imperfect options with all three of the strikers that are there at the moment.
Certainly, significantly imperfect is the polite way of putting it. Yeah, but we'll leave it at that. Alan, you also had a little look at some of the more individual performances, specifically Dane Murray. So he had a cracking day on Friday, signed a new contract, scored a goal. But what was your impression of his performance, and where does it leave you in terms of his potential involvement in the longer term this season?
Yeah, so again, great day for him, new contract, goal, full 90 minutes for Celtic, brilliant. Assessing defenders is more tricky with data, as we've said often. So again, just trying to kind of weave the narrative really that comes out of these not lots of numbers on the screen there. Clearly not under a huge amount of pressure, Celtic, not a lot of actual defending needed to be done. But specifically, we do get exercised by aerial duel Ray, and my impression watching, or one of my memories that formed in my head as I was watching the game was, because the Celtic TV commentators were noting how 6'4" Murray has kind of bulked up a bit over the years and got more muscly. So then to be watching him out jumped by 5'11" Ross McKeever was kind of not what I was hoping for. And it did happen, unfortunately, on a couple of occasions. Now, Ross McKeever has got a particularly good leap, and it just goes to show you that being 6'4" isn't all that when it comes to winning aerial duels in football. It's far more about strength, positioning, timing, decision making on where and when to move your body. I mean, Carter Vickers doesn't actually get involved in many aerial duels because he will simply look to muscle the other player out the way and then recover the ball somehow. And given that he's like barely 6 foot, that's a very wise use of his personal resources. McKeever, again, it's one of his super strengths, really, probably is a super strength that he can play that lone striker role. He's not particularly fast and he's not particularly big, but he's got good timing in his leap. And Murray was caught out with that a couple of times. So there's definitely development there for Murray to how can he use his newly muscled, shiny 6'4" frame to be more dominating in those aerial duels. There were a couple of bad rickets as well, a couple of pack turnovers that led to dangerous moments for Falkirk. One in particular in the first half that Calv, I think it was McKeever, actually had a shot which was very, very, very poor. Just a couple of stray passes really. So that obviously is a concentration thing. Passing really is the area that, as a Celtic centre half, as we've seen with Liam Scales, he's preferred to Trusty mainly for that reason, even though his defensive skills, I would argue, are not as strong as Trusty's. His passing game, and the passing game to Celtic is deemed more materially important. 93% is probably a couple of percent lower than you'd want to see from a centre back. You almost want perfection for centre backs. You really don't want your centre backs giving the ball away, because I mean that generally means trouble, right? But 93% does speak to the fact that he was a little bit more expansive in his passing. He completed 27 pack passes, which is the most in the team, and his pack passing score was 101, which is second in the team. Trustees was actually higher. Now, therein lies the story, because really neither Dane Murray or Trusty were under that much pressure in their passing. And there was always a spare man out wide, meaning that even though we can all agree, and Brendan Rodgers agrees, that Trusty's passing out from the back is not the strong part of his game, he led the team in pack passing because of the passive nature of Falkirk. So you have to take Murray's scores equally with a pinch of salt, in that he really wasn't put under a lot of pressure. But and that the one standout number in all of the chart is where I've put pack pass percentage of all passes. So he completed, 85 passes. He attempted, let's say 90 or whatever. 32% of all the passes he attempted and completed were pack passes. That's a remarkably high number. The team average is usually around half that. So 32%. Our centre backs might be 20. If you're playing against a team that's not pressing the centre backs, they may hit 20%. So 32% is a noteworthy outlier of a number. But again, I would really caution getting too excited and giddy about that because, as I say, I think the way that Falkirk's set up really influences that to quite a high degree. But nevertheless, he posted the numbers from a passing perspective. I think he did well to grow into the game despite some of his early errors. I'd want to see him develop his jumping, positional technique in physically dominating strikers a little bit more. But that would be my summary.
Yeah, James, we're in a bit of a quandary with centre halves. Scales seems to be the best option we have at the moment, but not necessarily the preferred option for anybody. Trusty hasn't perhaps proved to be quite as good as people thought he was coming in. Carter Vickers remains the kind of only absolute cert whenever we can play him. Dane Murray's in a funny position. People forget he played in Ange Postecoglou's first pre-season match as Celtic manager all those years ago now, and still hasn't managed to kind of establish himself in the first team. Stephen Welsh, we've got, still hasn't established himself in the first team. Where does Dane Murray fit in for you in terms of his place in the squad and how we're going to use him based on what Alan's had to say about him and your own thoughts?
I think ideally, if he's going to ascend to be a potential, let's say, starting center back at Celtic, or even a first line of depth, whether that's a third or fourth center back in case of injury, rotation, that type of thing. I think he needs to ascend either on that physical side, as Alan mentioned, to become a dominant defender physically, or I think he has to refine the part of his passing game that seems to be a little bit deficient. And so I think you get players like Carl Starfelt, who were very simple, tried to keep it very simple, justifiably should keep it very simple because they weren't particularly good at picking out passing opportunities. So that I always try to think about it as kind of 3 steps. You've got the vision part of it, which is identifying someone who you want to pass the ball to. It's like a vision thing. Then you have the processing speed and the anticipation, the movement, the spatial intelligence. Say, oh, okay, I can make this pass. And then the technical proficiency to actually deliver it. Is those 3 kind of pieces. And I think he seems to be, he sees them, and they're somewhere between the technical ability and the spatial intelligence and processing where things fall apart. And these things are not, as Alan said, the way I think about them, they're not static. So Scales, for the most part, domestically is good enough on all 3 of those that he's pretty valuable and productive. But as soon as you start going up the quality spectrum, where the schemes, the defenders, their speed, their athleticism, their processing speed to anticipate and read body language, all these things that go into the competitive dynamics, that's when Scales starts to have a problem in this area, and his pack turnovers start to go up and that type of thing. So there's a spectrum and all these things kind of intersect. So I think I think it's still worth the investment because he's homegrown, because because Welsh will probably depart, one would think. So I think it's worth investing in him, even if it's another loan, maybe to see him if he can develop those 2 areas. One of them in particular needs to, I think, because he's either going to need to be the ball player or he's going to have to be the physical dominant one at Celtic. Ideally, if we got both, then we're going to end up selling him for 30 million or more, right? So that's the equation here. So we kind of have to hopefully get one of those 2 refined to the point where he can be dominant on a dominant team in one of those 2 facets.
Yeah, it's a quandary that I don't envy those at Celtic trying to find an answer to, because I don't see where it ends up. But Alan, we'll move on to the last couple of players that you've had a look at. You looked at Engels and McCowan in sort of context of each other's performances, because it's another position on the field where we don't really have a nailed down starter. Engels, you would think, is going to be the more long-term option, but Luke McCowan's been taking his position some of that time. But what did you find by comparing both their performances within the game?
So, firstly, I'm not expecting people to sit here and digest. I realise that for some people, especially on the phones, this is going to be pretty small, and some people are even kind of listening. So that's fine. By the way, Andy will put these slides up on the Substack underneath the post with the podcast on it, so people that do want to sort of peruse the numbers, but they're all from the stat pack anyway, so subscribers will be able to get that. And this will be available for everyone, all flavors of subscriber. Right, so obviously, listen, we're just about segueing into the Almaty game, and it's really in that spirit that I wanted to look at this, and with the question of, this wasn't to sort of analyse how these 2 players fared up against Falkirk. It was more to start thinking about, what is going to the midfield look like in this crucial Champions League qualifier. And Engels with 77 minutes and McCowan with 90 minutes got a full sort of run out. And the other reason I wanted to post it in this way as a comparison was because there was a hell of a lot of chatter that I could detect about Engels and nothing about McCowan. And I thought that was interesting. And it was generally positive about Engels. And I think the thing that kind of influenced the collective consciousness was the set piece delivery, right? Because he was putting in flat, rapid balls right into the middle of the 6-yard box, and obviously Murray scored from one, and there were other opportunities. Now Falkirk are not the best team in the world to be defending those situations. If we played that against Dundee United, they'll be heading them away quite happily. Any one of 11 players will quite happily be heading those crosses away. But against Almaty, actually, it will be very, very useful to have that attribute. So it was in that spirit, really. But I just wanted to sort of compare the two. And I think, again, I'm not going to go through this line by line. Don't worry. I just want to call out a couple of highlights. And this isn't to say that either player was great or either player was rubbish. It's just trying to highlight a few
No,
things.
Alan, you have to pick the best one. This is what the whole point. You've got to say who's the best.
So long story short is that, despite the airtime during and after the game, it was, I would argue, McCowan that was the more influential player. He almost had double the number of passes. Now, he did play 13 minutes more than Engels. You have to factor that in. He had double the number of passes, higher passing score. From open play, he created 3 chances to Engels 1. But obviously, Engels, fairy dust, created 3 chances from corners. Everyone loves a corner. And actually, Engels did generate more expected assist value. McCowan had one more danger zone pass, and he took out more defenders in the game. He was actually Celtic's best player when it came to taking defenders out of the game, with 7. So all of that really spoke to what an effective game McCowan had. That's not to say Engels wasn't effective. It's just that I would argue McCowan was more influential overall, but Engels had this sort of superpower of generating danger from set pieces, which, as I say, is something that a lot of people get very fixated upon. Engels had the higher overall expected scoring contribution, which is XG plus expected assists. So, and I thought that was interesting. It's an interest. I do like to sort of sometimes highlight things that are maybe slightly out of kilter with what I may perceive as public perception, because I think it's interesting and to think about why is that. So let's move on quickly because we need to get to the Almaty game. So it got me thinking about why the wider question of who starts against Almaty. I think Nygren's more or less nailed on for that number 8 sort of box crashing pseudo 10 support striker type role, which probably leaves one other beside Callum McGregor. And what I just wanted to throw in, and these are incredibly small samples of data. This is the season to date so far, but I thought that the numbers were so diverse, even with a very small sample, that they were interesting to call out. So what I'm focusing here is really against the ball, and the reason I'm doing that is because of the issues that I've called out on the site that James referenced earlier. The transition risk that Celtic are carrying by essentially having a rest defence of only 3 players. As I say, under Ange, it was often 5, and under Brendan Rodgers, it's often been at least 4. I can't remember the last time we've gone into a season having a rest defence of 3 players, meaning 3 players are defending in the event that Celtic lose the ball when they're attacking. And therefore, who has got the defensive chops out of the other midfielders that might help to reduce some of that risk, given Almaty's Kairat Almaty's plan will be to break. One of their big strengths is they keep 3 players high up the pitch nearly at all times, and they've got like a wonder kid in the middle, and they've got decent pace, and they can break very effectively. And so I've got 2 defensive statistics: defensive action success rate and possessions won from defensive action, expressed as I say, as percentages. And if you sort of rate the 3 number 8s there, it's actually McCowan that comes out slightly stronger in terms of 27% of his defensive actions won. He wins the ball back with 50% of his defensive actions. Engels is a little bit less than that, and then Hitatis is kind of off the scale. Hitatis is more the number so far in the 2 games that he's played that you'd expect from like a striker, frankly. Just almost non-existent defensive action success there. And then even more eye-watering really is I come back to our friend, the pack turnover score. So we talked about how Falkirk had a terrible day, struggled with Celtic's press, and ended up with a team. So the aggregate of each individual player was a team negative pack turnover score of 105. Rio Hatate is averaging 44 on his own in a Celtic team that attacks 75% of the time. That is a big reason why this transition risk is as strong, and we're making such a point about it. Engels in the minutes that he's had so far he's averaging -13, and McCowan only -8. Now McCowan probably plays a little bit further forward, which actually counterintuitively reduces that number a little bit because there's less players likely to be ahead of you when you lose the ball. But I think there's a strong case to be made purely as a defensive measure to play one of Cowan's or Engels against Almaty. And as I say, we'll get into Almaty and their strengths and weaknesses, but I think that's a key decision that has to be made. I'm almost certain Rodgers will go with Hatate, but I think because of their strengths and because of the risks that we've seen in the opening, especially the two games, not so much against Falkirk, I think there's a case to be made for maybe Engels, maybe, and actually Almaty are not strong defending set pieces, so it might be a case for putting Engels there for his athleticism, his ability to get up and down, and his ability at set plays, because I think Celtic will get a fair number of corners. So maybe that would be the deciding factor. But I think Luke Cowan's got a decent shout as well.
James, I always think when Alan puts cases like this up, I think to myself, I hope to God somebody at Celtic who actually gets paid to do this is putting that amount of consideration into things and into the selection. My suspicion is that regardless of what is presented to him, Brendan Rodgers will go with what on paper he thinks is his strongest 11. Is that an unfair assumption, or do you think that's the way he'll go with it?
I do think there's some nuance here because of the bare bones nature of the forward options. So if he decides, let me just put cards on the table. I suspect he'll go with Hatate and Nygren as the attacking eights, and then probably Forrest, I would think, as the starting right wing. And then once as has been the case in the league games, then Nygren would move out to the right, and I should say the second league game once the Yang experiment continued to go horribly wrong. So that would then, create the opportunities for Engels and presumably McCowan to come into midfield. So I suspect that's how it'll play, but I agree with Alan. Like if, as we get into Almaty here a little bit, I think that is the clear and present danger, particularly at Celtic Park, which is, this should be, when we look at, I mentioned last week about, the imperfect nature of some of the tools that we do have to try and assess their relative quality. When I think about Almaty, I think they've kind of slot in with like a Riga, to use a recent history team that we've played. So, we're probably going to have 80% of the ball, 75, 80% of the ball. They are going to be left trying to defend their own box quite a bit. And it's all going to be about set pieces and their counterattacking, their ability to, break against us. So even in a team that, given that math, even if they get a half a dozen opportunities at Celtic Park, would probably be I would think they'd be fairly content with that. I mean, that full-blown breaking, as I joke with Alan's pieces that he's written the last week, I call it the jailbreak, which is when you go, oh crap, we only have 3 guys and they've got 3, and they're running at full speed, and our guys are sprinting back. It's that moment. If they get 4 or 5 or 6 of those, I suspect they'd be content. And if they can, because as Alan said, they've got the pace. They've got this wonder kid who just turned 17. If they can convert just 1 or 2 of those, all of a sudden this becomes maybe a much more hairy tie than we would like to think, given the disparity of resources and kind of just the nature of the opponent. So I get the argument. I don't think it's going to happen, but I'd like to see Engels too. Like I think that I think the reputation on Hatate in the final third against bunkered opposition is way beyond the reality of how successful he is in that phase of play. Yes, he can pull off the worldies and his finishing can be good. But he can also be a primary source of giving the ball away. And how those things break game to game. He's an introduction of volatility to Celtic performances. So if he has one of his games, yes, he can be a decision maker or decider and really pull the game out. I don't think we need that against this type of an opponent. I think that if we play it smart and just continue the onslaught and try to cut down the amount of times that we gift them these jailbreaks. And to Alan's point, I think on set pieces, he is, like David Turnbull was before him, such a quality deliverer of dead balls that in and of itself is a weapon that is good enough to make him a consideration when all the other things are kind of equal or plus or minus. So yeah, I think Engels over Hatate on the left would be a reasonable variant. I don't think we're going to see it, but I'd be fine with it if it were to happen.
Yeah, Alan, James has reassured me somewhat there because I do fall into the old football fan trope of I don't know anything about this other team and therefore I think we'll be better than them. Do you agree with James that we will potentially have the more possession of the ball, the chances we'll create will be more numerous than them, or is there anything for us to be particularly worried about coming up against this team?
Yeah, so I took James's point about using ELO ratings. One of the points I was trying to make was the fact that we had these 4 matches against Astana way back in 2016-17, and even if you don't think that the ELO ratings are accurately reflecting the Kazakhstani league teams in relation to other teams in Europe, again, you can at least accept that they are representations of the Kazakhstani teams against themselves over time.
100%.
And this team appears to be significantly less talented than the Astana team that we played in 2016-2017. Almost 200 ELO points, which is a lot. That Astana team that we played was on an upward curve that peaked in 2018. They had some successes in European competition. If you remember, we had a 1-1 and I think a 2-1 win at home or a 1-0 win at home and a 1-1 over there. And then we had that 5-0 home win followed by that horrendous game where we were 4-1 down and eventually got it back to 4-3. So they were problematic. There's three main concerns, I guess. One is just a logistical one, which is going to Kazakhstan and playing I think in the afternoon in what will be very hot conditions. Now that's the second leg. Now it's far more egregious for them coming to us. So when we kick off on Wednesday at 8 p.m. Celtic Park time, that their body clocks will be at 1 o'clock in the morning. So that's not pleasant for them, really, to be fair. And I think we saw the Kazakh teams that have come to Celtic Park really struggling on occasions. As I say, outside of that Astana team that held us to 1-0, but again, context, they were quite a talented team and very talented by Kazakh standards. When we go there, I think I've got this right. So I think when it's a 5:45 p.m. kickoff, which I think, given that we're 5 hours ahead, means I think we're kicking off in the afternoon sometime.
No, I think it's actually the opposite. I think it's going to be like a 9:30 p.m. kickoff
right, okay.
local time in
local time, right?
Yeah,
fine. But okay, that's good because the daytime temperatures are around 30, 31 degrees. By nighttime, it's probably going to drop to a more sort of manageable high 20s, mid 20s, that kind of thing. I think as well because of the way the time differences work, and because the second leg's on a Tuesday, I believe we'll be able to get back to Scotland sometime during that Wednesday and have more or less 3.5 days, prep time for the Derby game on the Sunday. So I don't think that should be a massive issue. But just practically speaking, our history with these games is that we don't tend to dominate at home and then struggle quite badly over there. And actually, if you look at Kairat's journey to this point in the competition, they've won all 3 home games. They haven't conceded a goal, and they've lost 2 and drawn 1 away game. So it's imperative that Celtic, for me, I'm going to be nervous unless we're going out there with a 3-goal lead, really. That would be the minimum that I think we should be looking to achieve. And it is achievable. The concerns really are what we've talked about so far this season, which is, will we actually, depending on even who, no matter who the striker is and who we have on the wings, will we actually convert chances into goals? Is there sufficient quality there? Is there sufficient attacking quality on the bench to come on? And against a team who at that stage will be like their body clock's telling them it's 3 o'clock in the morning, can we actually get some late goals into the game? Have we got that quality on the bench to come on and do that? These are the main concerns. Having watched them a little bit in possession, they're quite interesting. They kind of build up a kind of a 5-and-5 or a 3-2-5. They split into 3 at the back with 1 centre half sitting and 2 drop wide, and then they put 2 centre midfielders in the middle, and then they seem to attack with 5 players. The 2 wingers really high, a centre forward, and then 2 players trying to sort of get between the lines. And they're quite happy to go long. They're a very technical side, technically very good on the ball. They're sprinkled with Brazilian journeymen. That will come back to haunt me. They can go longer. They've got a beanpole, a Brazilian centre forward that they might play, or they could have this 17-year-old Satpaev who's on his way to Chelsea when he's 18. They're very good on the break. They are very good on the break. They can transition very quickly, and this is again, unfortunately, is a good matchup for them with Celtic's issues that we've seen early in the season. Hasn't manifested in goals being given away, but nevertheless the risks are there. That's kind of the bad news, I would say. I think the good news. The other thing to note, I think, is they did score 2 goals from corners for this beanpole Brazilian in the last game. So that's a bit of a warning. They seem to be quite decent at attacking corners. They've had a lot of luck actually on this Champions League qualifying journey. There's 3 absolutely awful goalkeeping howlers have contributed to the 7 goals that they've scored. 3 of them have been goalkeeping nightmares, and one of them they beat Slovan 1-0 with a last-minute penalty that was. I mean, you'd be blushing at Ibrox if you saw that given. It was just the guy popped a free kick and just fell over, and the referee gave a penalty, and it's like I don't think the Slovan players were so stunned they didn't even protest. I couldn't see any contact, any interference. It was the 90th minute, and so they lost the game. 1-0. So they've benefited from a fair bit of fortune, and also the fair play to them in games where they have been. They were 1-1 with Ljubljana, and they were 2-0 down against a Finnish side. But they managed to get early goals, and these early goals gave them the confidence. It will be a packed stadium there; it's about 23,000, and so that if they don't get an early goal, I don't know how anxious that they will be. What is even more fascinating is out of possession. They seem to do a bit of a press. It seems to be situational. They're not always pressing. They're not. I couldn't see any evidence of them going man to man. It seems very zonal the way that they set up, especially in midfield and defence. They fall back into a 4-3-3, but they essentially defend with 7 players, and they always leave 3 up. Now that's a tremendous risk for Celtic, as we talked about this transition defence. And that's going to be 3v3 for us unless we change shape. But it also means that there's plenty of space for Celtic to attack. I didn't like them defensively. The bits I've seen, they don't look like to have a great deal of pace or physicality in defence, and seem to leave a lot of spaces between the lines, between the players as well. I think Celtic, if they're on their game, they'll find lots of packing opportunities, lots of between the centre halves or between the centre halves and the fullbacks. Those passes inside the fullback look like they're on all day long against this team. And as I say, they're not going to man mark Callum McGregor. They're not going to go to man, I don't think, against Celtic's number 8s. Now, that's against the teams that they've played thus far. They may change their approach because they're up against probably the best team that they've played so far. And set piece defending, not great either. So there's plenty of weaknesses there, but that transition threat is real and present, and unfortunately it chimes with Celtic's probably potentially a biggest Achilles heel as I see it so far this season.
Yes, well, hopefully none of those potential banana skins come to fruition on Wednesday night. James, Alan, thank you very much for joining me this week. For anybody who has not already, we would really appreciate if you would consider signing up to the huddlebreakdown.com Substack, where you can get all the information that we give you in these podcasts, plus a whole lot more. Alan, James, you'll see everybody later on in the week with Martin in the second of the podcasts, and I will see everybody next week.